Franz is a Catholic farmer living in the tiny Austrian village of St. Radigund with his wife, Fanny, and their 3 daughters. Life changes for this sweet family when war breaks out, and Franz gets called up for basic training with the German army at the Enns military base in 1940. At this initial stage of the war, this unit was not expected to be sent into a fight, and hence, despite being away from his beloved family for several months, Franz was able to find simple pleasures by making friends and taking life in its stride. Meanwhile, Fanny is left to take over all farming activities with her daughters and her elder sister, Raisi, for company. Luckily, when France surrenders to Germany, farmers like Franz are allowed to go back home, bringing about some much-needed normalcy in his family's life. Even as the war is expected to end, a couple of years go by without any intention of the war being history. Eventually, Franz and Fanny begin to spend their days dreading the arrival of the mailmen as men in their village begin getting called up to serve their nation yet again. Thoroughly disturbed by the prospect of raiding countries and being responsible for the ends of numerous innocent lives, Franz meets the priest of the village church one day. He tells him that fighting under the German banner is something that not only does he not want to do, but it feels like something he would be completely unable to do as well. In response, the priest urges Franz to think of his family and the consequences they will have to face if he chooses to act as per his thoughts. Being brutally honest, the priest even tells him that refusing to fight would certainly mean the end of his life, which will ultimately not help anybody. Having said so, he still promises to consult the bishop regarding the matter. Franz's love for his country strongly drives his belief that the Nazi war was an evil one, to the extent that not only does he refuse to contribute to the war effort for the families of veterans, he even chooses to deny the state allowance and subsidies he and his family are eligible for. With Fanny's support, he prefers to keep to himself and continues to diligently work on his land instead. Eventually, the day arrives when he gets to meet the bishop in an attempt to find some peace and validation for his thoughts. However, the bishop simply reminds him of his duty towards his nation instead. Further, the bishop tells him how even the church bells were being melted to make bullets for the war, implying that when the church was involved as well, how could a mere farmer choose not to be? In conclusion, their visit to the bishop was as good as meaningless, as Franz tells Fanny, while leaving that the church possibly thinks he was a spy, sent to confirm the kind of advice that was being given to men who sought direction in these challenging times. On the other hand, an artist lends a partially supportive perspective to Franz one day at church. He says that through his creations, it is easy for people to believe that they would have been motivated enough to do the right thing if they were around during Christ's time, specifying that he himself doesn't suffer while portraying all the sufferings of those times. The artist says that he has instead found a way to make a living out of it. Further, he warns Franz of the upcoming darker times when men will be clever enough to ignore the truth instead of fighting for it. As support for Hitler rises in the village, Franz continues to believe he is doing the right thing by resisting the fight and standing strong by his belief. While the family believes that he might not even need to fight since all farmers cannot just be taken away, Fanny begins to face the disappointment of fellow villagers for his apparent sinful behavior. Gradually, the family loses respect in the village and workers quit helping out on their land. About the incident, Fanny tells Franz that the females in the village whose husbands had gone off to fight the war believed that if they suffered while Franz stayed back the whole time, why should their safety be a concern for the men who were simply fulfilling their duty to their nation? Despite being visibly hurt by these factual sentiments, Fanny assures her husband of her support for him. Over the next few days, several people try to convince Franz to abandon his belief. The mayor even goes to the extent of accusing Franz of being a traitor because of his refusal to fight, and Franz's friend tries reminding him of how his father had fought in the previous war and sacrificed his life for the nation. However, nothing anyone says is enough to change his mind. As the war rages on, people's belief in God progressively reduces. Some come to believe that continuing on the path of belief would be insanity, while others believe that simply taking an oath to the Antichrist in the name of potential peace in the future wouldn't really be the end of the world. Through all of this, Franz and Fanny's belief stays stronger than ever. Life goes on as usual for them, till one day when the dreaded mail finally comes through announcing that the nation requires Franz's service. Despite all her inner turmoil and fear of being left alone, Fanny is unable to stop Franz from leaving. Eventually, bidding farewell to his family, including his mother and daughters, Racy and Fanny, Franz reports back to the Enns military base. While the procedure of his admission is smooth, upon refusing to take Hitler's oath, Franz is immediately arrested. Deeply affected by the sufferings of his fellow prisoners, he writes to Fanny about it all in a series of letters. In response, she writes back with stories about their daughters and their lives in his absence. For several months to come, these letters would be the only comfort for Franz and Fanny. Through all his hardships at the prison, Franz is approached by several Nazi officers who try to explain that his individual defiance was neither going to become an example for others, nor was it going to change anything about the war. However, having already placed all his faith in his belief, Franz continues to see the unjust and evil Nazi war for what it was. He undergoes punishments and has to carry out demeaning tasks, but he does all of that without complaining, as it keeps him away from the war. His eventual transfer to a prison in Berlin implies more torture by the Nazis, but Franz stays determined to be strong for as long as it was possible. Back home, the villagers continue to shun Fanny in their own ways. Nobody assists her with her work except for Racy, which has made life difficult for her even as people openly steal from their field. However, much like her husband, none of this causes her belief in God to waver. She writes to Franz assuring him that they wouldn't be sent all these troubles if God wasn't certain of their ability to endure them. Hoping to arrange a meeting with Franz, her visit to the military base one day yields nothing, as she isn't allowed to meet the colonel without having an appointment. Since, without his permission, she couldn't meet her husband, Fanny helplessly heads home. Meanwhile, amidst all the torture and beatings at the prison, Franz learns empathy and gains a perspective that teaches him not to be quick about judging people. Realizing that everyone makes decisions based on their own weaknesses, he rediscovers his own weaknesses in a new light. However, worried about not having heard from him in a while, Fanny finds her way to Salzburg with her father, hoping to get some information about him. Unfortunately, she is met with disappointment yet again. Meanwhile, Franz meets with Feldman, a court-appointed defense attorney undertaking Franz's case. Feldman suggests that instead of combat service, Franz could sign up for medical service instead for the charges against him to be dropped. As expected, Franz insists that he has no intention to swear loyalty to Hitler, irrespective of whether or not it is taken seriously. He makes it clear that not even the thought of freedom and the ability to go back home to his family would change his opinion about the Nazis and the war. Despite repeated attempts by the Nazis to break his determination over the next few months, his constant belief allows Franz to hold himself up through all of it. Meeting one of the friends he had made during training, Waldland, who was now at the same prison, helps lift Franz's spirit a bit more. While spending some time together one day, they discuss how the executioner wears a tall hat and always ensures a clean cut to minimize pain. Since Waldland was a criminal and a prisoner himself, he spoke of this punishment because that is what he expected to receive for his crimes. Awaiting his trial and judgment, Waldland spends some of his remaining time daydreaming about an alternate life with Franz. In July 1943, Franz's case finally went to trial at the Reich's military tribunal. During the recess, the proceeding official speaks to Franz in private and urges him to rethink his position. Determined to stand by his choice, Franz insists that he cannot agree to do something that he thinks was wrong, even if it was a non-combat service for the Nazis. As a result, Franz is found guilty and sentenced to death. Even so, his defense attorney, Feldman, informs him that he could still opt for the non-combat service before his sentence is confirmed if he changed his mind and wished to be free. Knowing that Franz would not sign the necessary papers, Feldman reaches out to Fanny instead. Accompanied this time by the village priest, she immediately gets to Berlin. Fortunately, once they reach the prison, a meeting is arranged with Franz. Along with Feldman, the priest tries to convince Franz to modify his stand and get his charges dropped so he wouldn't have to face an execution. They even tell him that the possibility of the war being over soon would mean that even if he signed up for non-combat service, he might not have to work for too long. They also insist that just saying the oath would not mean that he had to stop thinking the way he did. Not bothering about the others, Franz asks Fanny if she still understands his perspective and believes in him. Determined to always stand by her husband, she assures him that she will always love him no matter what he does. Franz finds comfort in Fanny's words, despite the toll it takes on her to support her husband. After all, he was willingly walking towards his end, and it was certainly not going to help anyone. No wife could ever truly be completely fine agreeing with such a decision that disregards everything their family has been through. Leaving behind just an apology letter for his beloved daughters, mother, and wife, promising to meet them again in heaven, Franz is eventually executed on 9th August 1943. On the day of continuously praying, Franz awaits his turn with Fanny's voice in his ears and the views of the beautiful Austrian Alps in his mind. When it was time, as Waldland had once described, the executioner in the tall hat approaches Franz. The film ends with Rezi and Fanny working hard in the field. Fanny continues to hope that one day they will know the purpose of their lives and the reason for the hardships they had to endlessly endure. That day, she believes, they will build their country again.